let's get to this idea of technology, because this is a common thread throughout so much of this music as well. And I would like to think of this in two ways. One is that music and musical performance is the technology itself, right? It is the tool through which a message is spread. It is the tool through which, um, you know, freedom can be achieved. These notions of freedom, salvation, healing, these are common threads in so much of Afrofuturist music. And this is demonstrated in a couple different ways. For one, we see a different approach to the band, the ensemble. What does it mean to be in a band or a group? Um, and to think of that as what I like to call, this egalitarian cooperation, that all these people are in the band working together to make something bigger than themselves happen. Now, let's think of this another way. I mean, it's so common where we think of an artist as being this creative genius, and everybody else is kind of this, hierarchy that exists beneath them. And I would say for some of the examples that we'll talk about this week, especially Parliament Funkadelic and such, it's really more about having the community get together, and the community is doing that work. Secondly, we're going to hear this in terms of musical form itself. Breaking down, well, what is a song? And challenging that very notion. That's a common thread as well. In a lot of Afrofuturistic music, that there's a strong pulse, repetition, rhythm, and that repetition rhythm, in a sense, are guiding forces, ways in which to help people deal with their situations. That dancing, right, is the thing that makes you feel better. And if you think about it, in so many, especially in 1950s, 1960s era American mainstream culture, dancing was often perceived to be as a dangerous thing. It was common in the 1950s, for politicians and preachers to, vilify so much Black music because it made people dance, and that dancing was uncontrolled. It was dangerous in some ways. Afrofuturist music re-envisions that as not being something dangerous and something to be afraid of, but rather it is the means to which we can actually be better. That it was going to heal us spiritually, it will heal us emotionally. And another sort of idea that kind of ties in with this is the fact that all of this could be experienced literally quite through the vibrations themselves. That the technology wasn't just, a nice idea layered on, but rather the vibrations had that power. Again, this is something that I think we can read into in a lot of Afrofuturist music. And then we have to deal with the idea of technology itself, right? And it's really common in a lot of the examples that we're going to talk about where we see instruments that were otherwise rejected, not considered to be real instruments or problematic in some way, that those instruments then become adopted and used because, well, one thing, those were the only tools left, right? And those were the things that were discarded. And so, African Americans taking those tools, those, things that are not valued, and giving them value, saying, look, there's something useful still here. And then also this idea of reimagining certain technologies. So, turntablism, reimagining a turntable not as something to recreate music with, but to create music with. That it's not just for playing and listening to, but rather we can use it to generate sounds. So that's one major idea there. We can think about, you're going to hear a lot of old instruments like bull roars and these kind of drony things, especially in Sun Ra's music, that, on one hand, they point to these kind of older civilizations. Bull roars are an instrument that comes from Australia, used by a lot of the Aborigine tribes there, and to imagine that instead as being the sound of the universe, right? Just like how we had talked about the didgeridoo, same sort of idea there. And even the electric guitar, reimagining the electric guitar not as, this kind of pop instrument that's kind of, for whatever, and especially too when we're thinking in like the 1960s and 1970s, electric guitar was seen as something like, for teenagers. It wasn't a serious instrument, but to instead reimagine what that sound could do. And so I, gave you this picture here of Prince playing this, ridiculously futuristic looking guitar. And he was kind of really well known for these wild guitar shapes. And in a sense, it's kind of pointing to that kind of rejection of mainstream tools and embracing instead something that's wildly different, wildly new. Then we get the look of it, the visual rhetoric, if you will, of Afrofuturism. So in a lot of the Afrofuturist examples we're going to look at, you're going to see these over-the-top costumes, these kind of, enormously large stage production that Womack calls the exuberance of craziness. That it's so over the top, it's so ridiculous that you're not supposed to take it seriously in a way, but rather that you're supposed to just enjoy the wildness of it all. And already we see a difference here between so much science fiction of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, in which, the future is supposed to be very proper, very controlled, very organized, very clean, right? Almost antiseptic in a way. And that is not really the vibe of Afrofuturism. It's not about some sort of technically derived minimalism, but rather it becomes effusive. It becomes bright and vivid, just like all of the outfits you see here. And in a lot of ways, these outfits here are drawing from, African art, textiles and whatnot. The patterns that we see in a lot of cloth that comes from, let's say, countries like Senegal, right, or Benin or South Africa. Taking those patterns and not seeing them as being a product of Africa in some backward-looking way, but rather this is the way forward. This is the future. And so it's a differentiation from a lot of the visual rhetoric that we typically associate with futurism. So I think, just to kind of expand on this some more, these ideas that in so many ways, science fiction that we've been dealing with is always perceived as something that is rational and controlled. And that in a lot of the Afrofuturist works we're going to talk about, it's that lack of control that is supposed to be a positive force. And so here, in the upper right-hand side, that's George Clinton, who we're talking about. Just below him is Janelle Monáe, and then the very bottom is Sun Ra's Orchestra, who we'll also talk about this week. And we can see in all three of these examples, right, that this outward appearance is demonstrative of celebration, craziness, being over the top. And then we get to a third idea, this idea of what's called signifying, and not signifying, but this like play on words. What does this mean? Well, it's the play on meaning itself. So signification, this gets us into notions of semiotics, of how a word, a concept gets attached to an object or an idea, right? So I can show you a picture of a stop sign without stop being written on it, and that image, right, the red sign will say to you, stop, even if you don't see stop on it. the concept is attached to the sign. Um, and there's, whole fields that study notions of semiotics and whatnot. In signifying, here's where instead of having some sort of one-to-one connection, you actually reverse that connection, where a word means the exact opposite of what you're actually saying. So, it used to be slang, you'd say, um, you know, James Brown was just a bad motherfucker, right? And you're not saying that he was a bad guy, but rather that, like, you say bad, it's like, man, he's so good. Um, or, we're just getting stupid here. Well, it's in some ways, when we're saying you're getting stupid, it doesn't mean that you're literally getting stupid. It's pointing to something else, right? So in so much of Afrofuturist work, there's always this quality of irony and humor and signifying, where you're not supposed to take it seriously, and it's supposed to be playful. So Henry Louis Gates, he is a scholar who specifically talks about this idea, and in a lot of ways, he frames this as a political act. That on one hand, it says, yes, I'm fully aware of what this means, but I don't need that, right? It's the awareness of some sort of mainstream culture that one does not feel a part of, or one does not necessarily want to accept in the way that it's being presented to them or forced upon them. Right? I would also argue this ties into ideas that go way back in African mythology, this idea of the trickster. So who is the trickster? The trickster typically is this character in a lot of African mythology, a spirit or an animal type, who is this intermediary between gods, other spirits, and humans. And they're supposed to, on one hand, quite often the trickster is supposed to tell humans what they're doing wrong, or at least teach them what they're doing wrong. But the trickster, being the trickster, does it in a way that actually, messes with the humans, because they clearly don't get it. And I would argue that signifying is, part of, this kind of trickster practice, that you have somebody who's so smart, but they're going to mess with you. They're going to joke around with you just to help prove a point. So think about those three ideas as we go through all this. Music as a technology, the dress and visual rhetoric of so much of Afrofuturist works, and how there's always this play on signifying, that there's always that message that is being given through, through this lens of humor, through this lens of irony, of tricking people in some sort of way.